James Brown was the godfather of soul, soul brother number one, Mr. Dynamite, and the minister of super heavy funk. He was also known as the hardest working man in show business and king of the one-nighters, because at one time he performed as many as 350 gigs a year. All these titles are to the point, and they illustrate Brown's importance as one of the most influential musicians of the 20th century, who laid the foundations for the way rhythm is played and heard in much of popular music today. James Brown invented funk, which not only became a genre on its own right, but also became a crucial influence on rock, soul, pop, hip-hop, and African and Latin American music, and so on. Brown was a singer who moved the soul genre forwards, with a powerful vocal style that incorporated influences from blues, gospel, jazz, country, and rock, as well as a stunning ability to scream in tune. Brown was also a songwriter, band leader, arranger, and producer, and a consummate showman who developed spectacular and acrobatic dance routines that were a huge influence on musicians like Mick Jagger, Michael Jackson, Prince, and many, many more. Finally, Brown broke down boundaries of racial segregation and championed black empowerment. In 1968, he recorded a song called "Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud," which became a rallying call for an entire black community. The phrase continues to empower black people today. James Brown's life was an archetypal rags to riches story that also had a darker side, with arrests for domestic violence, theft, assault, and drugs and weapons charges. Despite this, Brown was and remains a global icon, one of the few artists who changed music so profoundly that it's possible to speak of a time before and after. In this video, we look at Brown's life story and how he managed to not only become one of the leading artists of his day with 17 #1 singles in the Billboard R&B charts to his name, but how he invented an entirely new rhythmic feel and genre of music, and thereby shaped the history of music.
Get up, get on up, get up, get on up, get up.
James Joseph Brown was born in a wooden shack in Barnwell, South Carolina on May the 3rd, 1933. His mother, Susie Bailing, was only 16 years old. His father, Joseph Gardner Brown, was 21. Amazingly, for someone who would go on to become a famous singer, Brown was given the kiss of life born after his birth, as he was still born. He survived because an aunt breathed air into his lungs. According to Brown, he's of African American, Native American, and Asian descent. His parents separated when he was 4, and he was raised in a brothel in Augusta by an aunt called Honey. Brown grew up in extreme poverty. At one point, he was sent home from school because his barely there clothes were too shabby. He earned some pennies buck dancing for soldiers, polishing shoes, and picking cotton. Already as a boy, Brown loved music, from the gospel music in church to the swing and blues music he heard on the radio and jukeboxes. Hearing jazz and R&B singer Louis Jordan perform on the radio inspired him to become a singer and an entertainer. In his teens, he briefly flirted with boxing as a career, but all his plans were put on hold when he was convicted of theft at the age of 16 and put in a juvenile detention center. Just like Brown would do at many points during his life, he turned a setback into a stepping stone. While in the detention center, he received the nickname Music Box because of his vocal talents. He also met with fellow singers John Terry and Bobby Byrd and formed a gospel quartet. Terry and Byrd would both go on to play important roles in Brown's career. Byrd was, in 2012, inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Brown was released from the detention center in 1952, and 2 years later, he joined a vocal group called the Avons, founded by Bobby Byrd, that had started out as a gospel group, but then moved on to R&B. Brown alternated between playing drums and singing. In 1955, after having gone through several name changes, the group took on the name The Famous Flames. Little Richard's manager, Clint Brantley, saw them perform and was impressed enough to agree to manage them. Initially a covers band, The Famous Flames started performing songs written by Brown. One of them was Please, 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 which he had co-written with John Terry, inspired by Baby Please Don't Go, a hit for the Orioles in 1952. A demo of the song was in high demand at local radio stations and picked up by Ralph Bass, A&R man and producer for King Records. With the help from Brantley, Bass recorded the song on February the 4th, 1956 at King Studio in Cincinnati, Ohio. King Records label boss Sid Nathan didn't like the song nor Brown's belting and had to be coerced into releasing Please, Please, Please. He did so in March of that year on Federal, a sub-label of King Records. Proving Nathan wrong, Please, Please, Please gradually became a major hit and the label's biggest single, and went on to sell 1 million copies.
I love you so.
The song has become a classic, and in 2011, Rolling Stone magazine included it in a list of the 500 greatest songs of all time. The success of Please, Please, Please established Brown as the undisputed leader of the group. In 1957, he hired another manager, Ben Hart, and when the name of the group was changed to James Brown and the Famous Flames, the band quit, apart from John Terry. Brown hired 3 former backing vocalists of Little Richard's as replacements and performed with them and a new backing band. The group's next 9 single releases flopped, leaving Brown and his group in danger of being dropped by the label. However, a ballad that Brown had co-written with several others impressed Sid Nathan, and was recorded with top session musicians, including jazz great Kenny Burrell on guitar, at the Belltone Studios in New York on September the 18th, 1958. It was released in October under the title Try Me, with Brown taking all the credit as the writer. The song became Brown's first #1 on the Billboard R&B charts, and Nathan's plan to offload Brown and his group was shelved. In 1959, Brown changed the group's lineup again. Bobby Bird was asked to return and joined by vocalists Bobby Bennett and Lloyd Stallworth. The Famous Flames and the backing band, which would become known as the James Brown Band, debuted at the Harlem Apollo in New York in April of 1959. For the next years, James Brown enjoyed several hit songs, including a novelty hit, Do the Mashed Potato, under the name Kendrick and the Swans, released on the Dade label.
Hash brown potato, yeah.
Brown's hit songs with the Famous Flames included I Want You So Bad, Think, Bewildered, Don't Mind, This Old Heart, I'll Go Crazy, Shout and Shimmy. King Records also released 5 James Brown and the Famous Flames studio albums during this period. Please, 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 Try Me, Think, The Amazing James Brown, and James Brown and his Famous Flames Tour the USA. On October the 24th, 1962, James Brown and the Famous Flames performed another concert at the Apollo Theatre in Harlem. Brown paid for the recording of the concert himself because label boss Sid Nathan refused to fund it, judging it a waste of time and money. In 1963, a 31-minute excerpt of the concert was released as Live at the Apollo. Brown's instincts once again proved correct, because the album spent 66 weeks in the Billboard album charts, reaching #2. The album had a huge and lasting impact, and in recognition of this was inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame in 1998, and in 2004 was added to the National Recording Registry by the Library of Congress. Recorded by Tom Nola, Live at the Apollo is often described as one of the greatest live albums of all time. By this stage, Brown had developed a stage routine that involved advanced footwork and dancing, with Brown at one point pretending to fall to the floor and then being helped up by some of his band members. A cape was part of the act, in part influenced by wrestler Gorgeous George. Brown's early days listening to religious music provided an inspiration for the stage act, as he later explained. When I'm on stage, I'm trying to do one thing, bring people joy, just like church does. People don't go to church to find trouble, they go there to lose it. Brown's showmanship and the excited reactions from the audience are a large part of the appeal of Live at the Apollo. Musically speaking, the album captures electrifying performances of hits like Try Me, Think, I Don't Mind, Please, 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 and most of all, an extended 11-minute version of Lost Someone.
When the clock strikes 3, I don't want your boyfriend bothering me.
The music is a mixture of soul, gospel, jazz, rhythm and blues, and rock, played with a great intensity by a 12-piece band, featuring an 8-piece brass section that included the music's arranger, Lewis Hamlin. Vocals were provided by Bobby Byrd, Bobby Bennett, Lloyd Stillworth, and of course, Brown himself. James Brown adopted the name Mr. Dynamite around this time, and with the clout afforded to him by the success of Live at the Apollo, he started a label called Try Me Records, under license of King Records. One of the acts he signed was 17-year-old Tammy Montgomery, with who he also started a relationship. The singer later became known for her duets with Marvin Gaye under the name Tammy Terrell. The Try Me label was closed again in 1964 because of a legal dispute between Brown and King Records. Brown had started his own production company, Fair Deal, and linked it with Smash Records, a subsidiary of Mercury Records. By the time King had succeeded in getting an injunction, several tracks had been on Smash Records, including Out of Sight, released in July of 1964, which Brown later earmarked as his first move towards funk.
You know you're out of sight.
Brown recalled, "You can hear the band and me start to move in a whole other direction rhythmically. The horns, the guitars, the vocals, everything was starting to be used to establish all kinds of rhythms at once. I was trying to get every aspect of the production to contribute to the rhythmic patterns." Brown re-signed with King Records at the beginning of 1965 and recorded Papa's Got a Brand New Bag at Arthur Smith Studios, Charlotte, North Carolina in February. The song was a reworking of Out of Sight and was another important milestone in the development of funk. The emphasis in the beat had shifted from 2 and 4 to the first beat of the bar, or the one as Brown called it, with the horns playing staccato rhythmic accents. Papa's Got a Brand New Bag was released in June of 1965, and Brown noted that it was years ahead of its time. I was still called a soul singer, but I had gone off in a different direction. I discovered that my strength was not in the horns, it was in the rhythm. I was hearing everything, even the guitars, like they were drums. Later on, they said it was the beginning of funk. I just thought of it as where my music was going. The title told it all. I had a new bag. Papa's Got a Brand New Bag spent 8 weeks at the top of the American R&B charts. It also earned Brown his first Grammy Award in the Best Rhythm and Blues Recording category. Later, in 1965, the single I Got You, I Feel Good was released, which also went to number 1 in the R&B charts and number 3 in the general single charts. I Got You, I Feel Good was another seminal moment in the development of funk, with the 12-piece band again with an 8-piece horn section that included Maceo Parker on alto saxophone. The band laid down a funky rhythm that still sounds modern today. Guitarist Jimmy Nolan, bassist David Williams, and drummer Melvin Parker play a powerful groove, punctuated by the horns. Brown's vocal screams at the beginning and the end have been sampled on many hip-hop records.
I got you. Wow, I feel nice.
James Brown could do no wrong at this point, and in February of 1966, he recorded a ballad at Talent Masters Studios in New York that would become one of the best-known songs of his career. It's a man's world. The song was a long time in the making, with early influences including a song Brown wrote in 1963 for Tammy Montgomery, I Cried, that also has the same chords. Brown co-wrote the song with Betty Jean Newsom, although she has claimed to have written it all by herself. The song is in E-flat minor with a 12/8 triplet blues rhythm. The version recorded in 1966 included Bernard Pretty Purdy on drums, Billy Butler on guitar, and was arranged by Sammy Lowe. The song was ideally suited to Brown's emotive singing, and he performed it for the rest of his life. It's become one of the classic songs in popular music and has been covered by many artists, including Van Morrison, Josh Stone, and Christina Aguilera. It also was used in several Hollywood movies, including A Bronx Tale in 1993, Gunshy in 2000, and Birds of Prey in 2020.
But it wouldn't be nothing not a woman or a girl.
In May of 1967, James Brown recorded a song called Cold Sweat at King Studios in Cincinnati that has been credited as being the first true funk song. Cold Sweat is a development of a song Brown recorded in 1962, I Don't Care. The new song was based on a bass line that the singer sang to arranger, co-writer and saxophonist Pee Wee Ellis, who added horns that are directly inspired by Miles Davis's So What. Brown also developed a guitar part and asked the drummer Clyde Stubblefield to delay the snare on the fourth beat by an eighth note. The song began Brown's habit of calling out to the drummer to play a drum break. The focus on rhythm also meant less emphasis on chords and melody. In fact, Cold Sweat has for most of the time only one chord, with only one chord change in the bridge, and has a modal feel. The overall arrangement was very sparse, and Brown's declamatory singing style later became an influence on rapping. When it was released in July of 1967, Cold Sweat sounded revolutionary. The song became the blueprint for funk music and has been extensively sampled by hip-hop musicians. Cold Sweat was the opening song of an album with the same name. Several more essential funk releases followed in quick succession, including Licking Stick, Funky Drummer, Ain't It Funky, I Got the Feeling, Mother Popcorn, and culminating in arguably the greatest and most famous funk track of all time, Get Up, I Feel Like Being a Sex Machine.
Get on up, stay on the scene. Get on up like a sex machine. Get on up.
Like on Cold Sweat, Brown's funk tracks in the late 60s and early 70s featured music stripped down to its bare bones, with all focus on the rhythm and other instruments playing interlocking, repetitive patterns. Rhythmic influences included New Orleans funk as well as Afro-Cuban and African rhythms. Brown's innovation of putting the emphasis on the one was the foundation of the rhythm, which freed up the band to be much more creative and allowed heavily syncopated accents in the rest of the beat. The foundation of the rhythmic feel was obviously laid down by the drummer. In studio recordings, this often was Clyde Stubblefield, who had a soul and jazz background, and sometimes John JABO Starks, who was more influenced by the blues. In another innovation that influenced many who came after Brown, from 1965 to 1970, Brown used both drummers in his live band. Brown was around this time also writing and releasing political songs that were inspired by the civil rights movement. In particular, Say It Loud, I'm Black, I'm Proud, recorded in Vox Studios in LA in August of 1968 and released the same month.
Say it loud. Say it loud.
In the late 60s and early 70s, legendary jazz trumpeter Miles Davis also was on a journey of musical discovery, with more and more emphasis on rhythm while stripping down harmony and melody to an absolute minimum. Davis explained this was part of his search for the African origins of American music. It is likely that Brown was motivated by the same impulse. Many of Brown's late 60s and early 70s recordings would become enormously influential in later decades, and still are today. Funky Drummer, in particular, has become one of the most sampled pieces of music of all time. The drum break played by Clyde Stubblefield is often seen as just as foundational to the hip-hop genre as the Amen drum break, recorded in 1969 by the Winstons, with Gregory Coleman on drums.
Oh, get it! God.
While Brown's influence obviously reached far into the future, his recordings were having an immediate and huge impact on his contemporaries, even as far as Africa, where Nigerian artist Fela Kuti was strongly influenced by Brown's funk. Kuti's famous Afrobeat style was predominantly a blend of funk and African music. Just like the emergence of Bob Marley a few years later quickly established reggae as a genre in its own, funk became a separate genre in the US within months of Brown releasing his groundbreaking funk tracks in the late 60s. Many funk bands emerged, among them Sly and the Family Stone, Funkadelic, Booker T and the MGs, and the Pacemakers. The Pacemakers provided the foundation for Brown's new band after most members of his band left in March of 1970 over pay issues. The new band was called the JBs. The rhythm section consisted of two members from the Pacemakers, brothers William Earl Bootsy Collins on bass, and Phelps Catfish Collins on guitar, plus drummer John JABO Starks and organist Bobby Bird, who remained from the previous lineup. There were also 3 horn players. It was this lineup that recorded Get Up, I Feel Like Being a Sex Machine on April the 25th, 1970 at Starday King Studios in Nashville, Tennessee. They also recorded classic and often sampled funk tracks like Superbad, Soul Power, Talking Loud, and Saying Nothing. The 1970 double album Sex Machine contains studio and live recordings by this band, as well as the earlier band. It is widely regarded as one of Brown's most important albums and appears on many greatest albums of all time lists. The band also did a European tour at the beginning of 1971, a recording of which in 1992 was released as Love, Power, Peace. Brown disbanded the band after the European tour, and both Collins brothers would go on to play crucial roles in one of the greatest funk ensembles of all time, Parliament Funkadelic. Perhaps unsure of where to go next, Brown recorded an instrumental album with a 4-piece band, including co-songwriter David Matthews, with Brown playing organ and harpsichord. Released in April of 1971, Show Is Funky Down There contains mostly psychedelic rock and blues and is an oddity in his oeuvre. Brown returned to his funk style with his next album, Hot Pants, which was his first for Polydor Records. It featured a new band that included old stalwarts Bobby Bird on vocals and organ, Fred Wesley on trombone, and JABO Starks on drums. In 1972, Brown released 2 more studio albums, There It Is and Get On the Good Foot, that again contain a combination of a couple of great tracks and filler. However, The Payback, released in December of 1973, is regarded as one of Brown's most coherent studio albums and was rewarded with a #1 position on the US R&B charts. Jimmy Nolan had returned on guitar, next to guitarist Helen Cheese Martin, and the album contained 2 hit singles, the title track and Stone to the Bone. The title track in particular has again been widely sampled. Next up was a double album, Hell, made with arranger David Matthews and released in June of 1974. It's also seen as one of Brown's stronger albums. It spawned 2 #1 hit singles, My Thang and Papa Don't Take No Mess. The former was played by a 16-piece band that included David Sanborn on sax and Joe Beck on guitar. And it's yet another song that has been widely sampled, including by Kanye West and Jay-Z. On top, Papa Don't Take No Mess was covered by Steely Dan in 2011. Brown's next album, Reality, was released in 1974 as well, but critics began to notice there had been no musical progression in Brown's music for a couple of years. There was also a decline in the chart positions in his songs and albums. Reality did, however, contain the popular track Funky President, People It's Bad, again with David Sanborn and Joe Beck. By the mid-70s, Brown was dealing with multiple issues. His support for Richard Nixon during the presidential campaign of 1972 had cost him a large part of his black audience. His income was declining as a result. And to compound the problem, the IRS began chasing him for tax payments in 1973. All this led to the collapse of his businesses a few years later. On an artistic level, Brown seemed unsure of where to go to next. His funk direction had consisted of tracks that had been recorded live in the studio with very little post-production. It is what makes them ideal for sampling. But by the mid-70s, advanced production techniques became an essential part of popular music. And by comparison, Brown's tracks sounded too raw and basic. While his funk rhythms were a foundational influence on the disco genre that was taking the US by storm, the far slicker new genre made his funk tracks seem old-fashioned. On top of all this, disco was a youth genre, and a jump on the disco bandwagon for a 40-something artist like Brown inevitably led to credibility problems. Sex Machine Today, the album released in 1975, was a rather obvious attempt to both revive the good old days and connect with the disco trend of the day, and it flopped. Brown's next album, Get Offer That Thing, released in 1976, did better, and the title track was arguably his last hit in his own funk style.
Get up off of that thing and dance till you feel better. Get up off of that thing.
Brown did enjoy a few more hits in the late 70s, including the ballad Kiss in 77 and the disco influence It's Too Funky in Here. The latter appeared on an album called The Original Disco Man, released in 1979. It was produced and arranged by Muscle Shoals and Millie Jackson producer Brad Shapiro, and was characterized by a contemporary sound, with synthesizers and a modern mix and production. Despite the unpromising title, The Original Disco Man was a respectable addition to Brown's oeuvre. However, he was, by now, tagging on to new trends rather than inventing them. The struggle to formulate a coherent and relevant musical vision remained the big challenge for the remainder of his recording career. Brown left Polydor in 1981, blaming the record company for the lack of success of his records. During the final 25 years of his life, Brown released another 10 more albums. Only Gravity, I'm Real, Long Overdue, and The Next Step enjoyed moderate success on the US charts. Like on The Original Disco Man, many of the tracks on Brown's later albums were written and produced for him by others, which dramatically changed the feel of his music. During the 80s, Brown also appeared in 3 movies: The Blues Brothers in 1980, in which he was brilliant, Dr. Detroit in 1983, and Rocky IV in 1985. The latter movie used the song Living in America from Brown's Gravity album. It was mostly written by Dan Hartman and Charlie Midnight, with Hartman producing, making it sound like fairly typical 1980s pop funk. Living in America was notable for a performance by guitarist Stevie Ray Vaughan and became a big hit around the world. It earned Brown a Grammy Award nomination for Best R&B Song and a Grammy Award for Best Male R&B Vocal Performance. I'm Real was another attempt by Brown to connect with the latest trends, and the album was mostly written, arranged and produced by hip-hop group Full Force under the motto, if you can't beat them, join them. Funky Drummer is sampled 3 times on the album, including on the title track, which include the following lyrics. But here I am, the man, who started it all, and I'm glad, 'cause I'm #1 original. I know I'm bad. There were other notable ventures, including a collaboration with rap musician Africa Bambaataa, resulting in the song Unity. But by the end of the 80s, Brown's darker side caught up with him when he was arrested for assault and on drugs and weapon charges. He spent nearly 3 years in prison and was released in February of 1991. There were also several civil suits for sexual harassment, as well as arrests for domestic violence. After his release from prison, Brown grew more and more into the role of a living legend. He continued to perform until the end of his life, regularly appearing at iconic events that celebrated his iconic status. For example, at the Super Bowl 31 in 1997. He also appeared in more movies, including Beat the Devil in 2001 and The Tuxedo and Undercover Brother, both in 2002. Brown's last television appearance was his induction into the UK Music Hall of Fame in November 2006. In that same year, he also started his 7 Decades of Funk World Tour, but it turned out to be very short-lived as he died on December the 25th, 2006. Brown had fallen ill at a dentist's office in Atlanta, Georgia, 2 days before, and it is said that he died of congestive heart failure as a result of pneumonia. However, there are persistent rumors that he was murdered. These rumors were the subject of an investigation by CNN in 2019. It only raised more questions, including about the backgrounds of the murder of Brown's son-in-law in 2007, the murder of one of Brown's wives years earlier, and allegations of rape, bigamy, and more. However, we're here to celebrate and highlight the contributions James Brown made to the world of music. They are so enormous that they are hard to overstate. Funk has become a dominant music genre, and he played a part in breaking down racial segregation and instilling pride in the African American community in the US. Brown also received many prizes, awards, and honors, including an induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1986, received a Grammy Award for Lifetime Achievement in 1992, and in 2003 was the recipient of a Kennedy Center honor. Today, funk influences can be heard in most of popular music. And in hip-hop, Brown remains the most sampled artist of all time. Brown put it very well in his autobiography. Others may have followed in my wake, but I was the one who turned racist minstrelsy into black soul, and by doing so became a cultural force. As Brown sang in 1988, he was the man who started it all, and the #1 original. I don't know if I can add anything more than he added himself. James Brown he's the father of funk. He's the father, the godfather, the grandfather. He is funk. When I first heard James Brown as a kid, my mind was blown. And it's interesting that in the 60s, he invented this genre, pioneered it. His musicians went off and formed other great funk bands as a result of being in his band. He was like Miles Davis. Musicians played with him and then went off and populated other genres and just kept growing. The thing about James Brown is that even though it sounded dated to listen to 60s music in the 70s, now when you go back and listen to Papa's Got a Brand New Bag, or you go back and listen to Sex Machine, Get On Up, if you listen to any of that stuff, it sounds fresh and different to this day. Maybe it doesn't have the same production quality as some of the disco stuff, which, Bob Clearmountain did a lot of that stuff with Chic, and they would it was so tight and so perfect and so amazing. But the groove and the feel of James Brown's music is unfreaking believable. There's no accident that Clive Stubberfield is the most sampled drummer that ever lived, and that James Brown's music is the most sampled music probably ever, especially in hip-hop. It's incredible. James Brown was a force of nature. He was easily maybe top 2 or 3 most important musicians of the 20th century. Thank you, James Brown, for all of the incredible music you gave us. And thank you, everyone, for watching. Please leave any comments and questions below. We'd love to know who else you would like us to feature. It's a pretty tough one to follow. We've done Bob Marley. We've done Miles Davis. We've done Wes Montgomery. We've done so many, Charlie Christian, Robert Johnson, now James Brown. I mean, it is insane. Billie Holiday. These artists are so important to modern music. Give us some more. Who else would you like us to feature? I really, really appreciate everybody who watches this. Have a marvelous time. So long, farewell, auf Wiedersehen, au revoir, adios, sayonara, tutines, goodbye.